You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey Doctorow,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Charlene Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is...
Thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Scott Shepard on the show with me. He has an amazing new book. It's called The Last Commandment, and it's I believe this is the first book in a new series, isn't it, Scott?
Yeah, that's the idea. I just turned in the second, and I'm starting the third. So there you go.
I love it. Well, this is a new look at a Scotland Yard detective story. If you love mysteries and thrillers the way I do, this is a must-have for your summer to be read pile. And go grab it today. We're going to have links in the show notes of this episode. The Last Commandment, available everywhere now, by Scott Shepard. Welcome to the show, Scott.
Thank you for having me.
I'm excited to have you, Scott. We begin each show with the same question. And this is going to be a bit of a loaded question for you because I know a bit about your history, but what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Wow, that's a good question. That's not, and no one's asked me that yet, so that's a good thing. Let me think that. Probably when I was a child, it was probably reading Hardy Boy books, to tell you the truth. It's like my paternal grandmother used to come from Kansas City, and she would bring me a couple of Hardy Boy books when I'm like, 6 or 7, and I would just gobble them up. And what I really loved about that was you get to the end, and on the last page it would say Frank and Joe next. Didn't know it, but in a month they were going to be involved in the case of the old mill. And I go, oh God, there's another one coming. And then, so anticipatory thing about having characters you sort of fell in love with that you wanted to see more of. That's the first thing that sort of sparked that. And I couldn't wait for the next ones to come, and it started from there. And then, the other thing is, I I grew up in a showbiz family who were all in the movies. They were all producers. And so I watched a lot of movies, a lot of TV. And I just think, I just love stories, and I read a lot. So I sort of said one day, I don't want to be a producer, even though I turned out to be one for a long time, because I didn't know exactly what that was. But if I could make up stories, that'd be great.
I've talked to lots of folks who have gotten inspiration from either, a relative, maybe an uncle or something who, was the crazy uncle who, would tell stories and set a great example. It's rare that I meet someone whose whole familial experience was kind of wrapped up in storytelling. That had to be, it's your childhood. It's the only childhood that you got to have. Right. But that has to be just magical in a sense.
Well, one of the things, because of the connections that my family had, the things that my dad did, who was a producer and also an agent, a big agent in Hollywood for a long time, and ran studios. So I, in terms of I would give people context of where some of this weirdness came from, writing stuff. When I was a child, again, Roald Dahl used to tell me bedtime stories. And I, at the time, when I'm 5 or 6 years, I used to do Uncle Roald. My dad happened to represent him, and his wife, Pat Neal, who was a great actress. And so Uncle Roald would, come up and, all I knew, he was the guy who wrote, as far as I knew, was Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and James the Giant Peach. I didn't realize until I was a little older that, he was one of the foremost great horror storytellers, short story writers. But he would tell me, he'd sit in my room and tell me a story like, once upon a time, he says there was a little boy named Scott who swallowed an octopus, and then the octopus laid eggs in his stomach. And then he would go, good night, and he'd walk out of the room. And I would sit there and go like, whoa, and I think I was equally, as I've told people over the years, equally horrified by what might be going on inside my stomach, but at the same time, totally intrigued by the mystery of it and the wonder of it all. And so that kind of led to a love of mystery, thriller, detective, fantasy and horror fiction.
So if your father would have been a carpenter, there's a good chance that at some point in your childhood you would have, gone to work with your dad either on a construction site or in his, woodworking shop or whatever. And, there would probably be menial tasks that you would be given, which, looking back would have realized that he was passing on some of the secrets of the trade to you, and not always in formal lesson format, but in practical application. Looking back and growing up in this storytelling family, were there ever moments where you knew that the craft was being handed down to you, or was this just the atmosphere that you just were absorbing life through?
I think it was the atmosphere more than anything else. I mean, truthfully, I really didn't understand what my dad did till I was in my teens. And my grandfather and great grandfather going all the way back. I mean, I really wasn't aware of what that was. I just knew they were involved in the movie business, and they knew a bunch of famous people. But I don't know. I think part of it, like the Twilight Zone, was a huge thing for me as a little kid growing up. I mean, I was just kind of aware of it. It was coming off the air, but I've seen all the 165 episodes. I used to, that to me was the first thing I think I fell in love with, like storytelling and this kind of storytelling, because it's genre storytelling, but all those stories are so wonderful that they're, about something else, and they just have this kind of genre thing to kind of, get a hold of you. But at the end of it, what I always took away from those stories was the heart and the lesson and the moral and all that stuff. So yeah, and then when I decided to start writing, and I kind of started writing, I was always kind of doing a little bit of it in high school, but coming out of college, my lessons with my father, who was would probably admit was a frustrated writer in himself, that he never wrote. He produced a lot of movies and ran studios, and he kind of did very literate, really kind of cool movies as he was responsible for. He produced Breakfast at Tiffany's when he was 30 years old, and ran studios that did movies like when he ran MGM, he made movies like Fame and The Champ and Shoot the Moon. And I think, so he was always kind of hard on me in terms of the sense that if you're going to do it, you got to do it well. And I remember when I first handed him something right out of college, I'd written a musical with a jingles writer from Tucson, Arizona, where I wrote the book and he wrote the lyrics. It was a murder mystery. There we are, because I've always been reading murder mysteries and thrillers. A murder mystery musical that we originally called A Little Knife Music, but then we changed it to Alibi of Broadway. And it was like kind of like the Maltese Falcon meets My Fair Lady, really kind of fun. And I handed it to my father, and you wait until the next day, and he goes, literally says, "Well, at least you finished something." And I'm going, oh. I go, okay. And as being a fairly competitive person and wanting to please my father, so I went off with the jingles where we rewrote it. And this time I submitted it through a friend of a friend who got it to a producer. And the next thing I knew, it was optioned by a Broadway producer in New York who had One More Time and Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat on, and Peter Allen. They flew me to New York because they wanted me to replace to kick off my jingles writer and have Peter Allen do the music, which I wouldn't do because I wouldn't, screw over my good friend. But it was a great experience. But then I come back and I give my dad the new play, not having said anything about it. I go, and the next day I said, "What do you think?" And he goes, "Well, it's better." I go, "Well, good, because I sold it to a Broadway producer." and that was some vindication. But it's funny. He would like tell me about things, and I think it was from his experience. And I think he just was pushing me because he was a sort of a self-made guy. He would tell me things like, "What could you write about that would be interesting to millions of people?" And I'm sitting there going like, well, that's not a very nice way of putting things, but I kind of realized that he was right, in the sense that, like the book, like The Last Commandment, I mean, is at its heart, what it's really about is these three people. It's really about, the Scotland Yard detective, the detective who works for it is estranged, and, the Scotland Yard daughter, but it's surrounded by this maniacal, serial killer that's killing according to the 10 Commandments. And I keep going, I could literally draw on almost everything that goes through the three of those people, from things in my life and emotions and stuff that they go through. But I can also say at the same time, I don't think I know anybody who's a maniac killing people according to the Ten Commandments. But what it allowed it to do, it gives you a foundation to kind of tell the stories you want to sort of tell. So in that way, I think my father was right. He said, the way if you want to write stuff that's interesting about yourself, you're going to have to put it on a platform where it becomes accessible to people, and then it'll sneak up on you.
Scott, you have been involved in some of the most beloved television series. As someone who grew up in the 70s and 80s, looking back, you were involved with The Equalizer, Miami Vice, The Outer Limits, Haven, Quantum Leap, some of the best TV of the 80s and 90s that I can recall. And I think that experience that you had there ties into what you're doing now, and I want to talk about that in just a minute. But how did you land at TV and working on? I guess what I'm really interested in is the ongoing storytelling of a drama series like Miami Vice or Quantum Leap, where you have this meta story that's going on, and then you have to figure out what to tell on a week by week basis that is a self-contained story, but then ultimately moves the greater narrative ever forward. How did you land there?
Well, I think it was sort of a natural progression in the sense that, I started collecting, like I said, started reading the Hardaway books that led to me reading like the Perry Mason books when I was like 9 or 10, the Earl Stanley Gardner books. And I started reading, then I discovered Ross MacDonald, when I was in high school, and that was the end of it. I was going, okay, I'm just hooked on these kind of books and thrillers. I now have, much to my wife's chagrin, like 10,000 first editions of mystery and thriller writers. A lot of them have now become friends, which is cool. But so, by being a lover of those kind of books, and, even like Agatha Christie, right? Hercule Poirot, 30 books, Miss Marple, 15 books. That idea of seeing self-contained stories, but, you get to watch that character progress some more than others in the course of books was something I loved. So as you sort of built, series television, the shows you talk about, particularly back in those days, as opposed to, we can get to where we're doing with the binge watching now, which is great also, is you're kind of, you're sort of primed to know how to do that. It's, so that's what kind of started me, and then the first show I did was a show called Matt Houston that was on, it was an Aaron Spelling show in the early 80s about a detective show. And it was kind of a meat and potato show, but it was kind of fun in the sense that it allowed us to do exactly what you're saying, come up with a story each week. If there was a little bit of an Uber arc, not that there was much one with that show, we were able to do it. Then I went and did The Equalizer for most of its run. And, that was a fabulous experience. And, got to live in New York for 3 years. It's where my love of New York comes from. It's in the book. I could even argue the fact that, and not even argue it, I could just sort of say some of that character, or certainly the actor, Edward Woodward, was somebody I was able to write for. Grant is sort of a version of that, that original character, his sense of humor, the way even my head, where he was in life. I think that's where that came from, because I've had this idea for this, this idea for this book, originally a movie, which I never did anything with, since back then, and I'm sure that's kind of where it started.
The Last Commandment is your third book that you published. Is that right?
Yeah, it's the third book, first mystery thriller, basically. Yeah.
So you started with Descending Sun, and then The Seventh Day, and now we land at The Last Commandment. What was it that, having had such an illustrious career, writing for stage and then for television and show running and all of that, what brought you around to writing prose?
Well, obviously, I think I always, wanted to, write detective novels, and I didn't get waylaid. It just became the way to make because I was sort of surrounded by people in the business, and we got, I had a partner that I was working with back then. We did Matt Houston with, and, then we kind of split up because he went off to go do movies, and we stayed friends all the years, and we're actually doing TV again 35 years later, adapting murder mysteries. But I always kind of, I never stopped reading those things. And what television kind of perfected my sense of structure. It structure's pretty easy to me. Like I've structured this book, every book with no outline is just coming off my head. I kind of know how to do that. And so that helped. And then we started working with, I started having the privilege of working with a bunch of novelists and adapting their shows, starting with, The Dead Zone, Stephen King. We did Haven, which we ran 7 years based on a novel of his called The Colorado Kid. And then I got introduced, like 12, 15 years ago to Harlan Coben, who had an idea. And I went to New Jersey and saw him, and it helped that we were both huge Bruce Springsteen fans. So we talked about that at his house for an hour, and he had this idea, and we sold the idea as a TV series and wrote a script together that didn't get made, but it was a pretty cool idea. I keep telling Harley she turned into one of his books. It was one of those standalone kind of tell no one type thrillers. But when we actually wrote the outline, or I wrote the outline after bouncing it off of him, I would normally write an outline like a page or two in my head, but I wrote a 45-page prose outline because I kind of wrote it in Harlan's style, because I wanted to say, okay, here's a TV series, you're buying Harlan Coben, basically, here's the version of it. Everybody thought Harlan had written it, so that was encouraging. And then that just over the next few years kind of progressed to where I just started writing more prose. I write long outlines, and there was this frustrated, I think, novelist in me. And television just got more and more. I mean, it's always been fine. It's just a little crazy and, just harder to get things done. And then I became friends with, and I'm still friends with Karen Slaughter, who we adapted her things, her Grant County books. And then she always said, hey, if you write a novel, I would, show it to my agent, Victoria Sanders, because I'd become friendly with her, and Victoria said the same thing. And then what had happened was two things happened at the same time. One was that a friend of mine, I learned suddenly, we were in Hawaii, my wife and I, on a vacation, and a friend of mine, it turned out he passed away. They dedicated a show to him on Modern Family. I hadn't been in touch with him for like 9 months, and I was sort of devastated because I knew he called me like 9 months earlier, and I hadn't gotten around to talking to him. And like the next day I said, you know what? It's sort of like, you never know what's going to happen. Sit down and start writing a book. And then I had this script that I had written for Fox like 10 years before called Dark Sands that, was back to that I had nothing ever happened with. And it's the first third of my first, it became the first third of my first book, Descending Sun. So I got, it was like a 500-page book. I had 140 pages from my 60-page script that translated pretty well. And then I had to figure out like what the other 2/3 of the book was. And that kind of moved forward from there. And then once I did that, I just started loving it. And then the second book has an interesting long story that, the Seventh Day, that came out of that. But I always kind of knew I'd end up wanting to write thrillers and mystery novels. And like I said, I had this idea for a long time.
Authors, I have a fantastic new service to tell you about. It's called PubSite. PubSite is a service to help you build your very own website, your home on the web, where you can promote your work and give your fans a place to connect with you. PubSite is a website platform that allows every author, regardless of budget, to have a great-looking professional website developed by the book marketing professionals at FSB Associates. PubSite is the new, easy-to-use DIY website builder developed specifically for books and authors. Whether you're an author of one book or 20, or a small publisher, PubSite allows you to build, design, and most importantly, update your website pain-free. No need to be dependent on a designer or webmaster to make a small but costly change to your website. Save the money and do it yourself. PubSite is the best platform for authors because it's a book-centric platform. PubSite was built just for authors and small publishers. Every design, feature, and layout is book-centric. They have customized designs for you to use. It's easy to build. No coding or HTML is necessary to create a stunning, professional-looking website with all the features you want. Get a custom domain name, yourname.com. It's simple to update. You can add all of your books, add a blog and a book tour, sell from any retailer, manage your email list and social media, and even do e-commerce. Build your website with a 14-day free trial, then pay just $19.99 per month, which includes hosting. And we offer packages starting at $499 to set up the website for you. Pub-site.com, the place to help authors find their home on the web. Looking for a tool to help you visualize your story before the drafting begins? PlotPens is cloud-based and optimized for any device. There's nothing to download. From the new writer who isn't sure how to tell their story to the veteran who can increase their productivity dramatically, we've had experienced writers lay out a detailed structure for several novels in a series in a matter of a few days. The app takes you through 4 steps of the process. The concept or log line. Make sure you have a solid concept that you can keep coming back to throughout the process. The outline, 12 beats and 3 acts, each has a description of what should be happening with examples. The board, 40 cards. We take the 12 beats and add sub-beats to those, breaking it down even further and being very specific about what should go into each. These also have examples and descriptions. Right. We take those 40 cards and turn them into a to-do list. For a 50,000 word book, it's about 2 cards per chapter roughly. We have a beautiful editor built into the app. You can export your manuscript to a PDF anytime with the click of a button. Let plot pens help you visualize your writing project. Use code HANK10 to get 10% off plot pens. plotpens.com.
Scott, I've talked to lots of authors who have either been actors before or screenwriters or directors, somewhere involved in the process, and they talk about novel writing in a way that that there's a freedom in it because you are the master of the entire domain. At some point when you're writing for screen or there's the assumption that this will be a collaborative process on some level. At some point you're going to finish this script and you're going to hand it to a director, and then they're going to interpret that, and then they're going to hire actors who then continue to interpret that, and then hopefully the director is steering the vision, but it kind of goes out of your hands. Was that experience for you writing prose? Did you feel that freedom that people talk about?
Absolutely. I mean, that was a big part of it. I mean, in television, I've always said it ad nauseum for years, is that I always say the first thing I would tell people in television is it's not a radio show. I was like, as long as your eyes and ears can see it, you don't need to write it as much or describe it. And then when I started writing novels, I went like, whoa, wait a sec, it is a radio show. Which was great because I always had loved writing my narrative and kind of sort of wasted, I think, on scripts where it's like I was kind of moving the camera around all the time and sort of telling exactly what I wanted to see. So that was one thing. You're exactly right in the sense the collaborative nature of television. I mean, I teach also. I've been teaching for 7 years a class in Austin at UT. And what I always tell these TV students, I'm saying, look, television is a collaborative process. Your script number 5 in a series is only as good as number 4. Number 6, you got to work with other people. William Goldman, one of the great screenwriters, in his book, I think, Adventure in the Screen Trade, he said, the first line of that, which is true about Hollywood, his first line in that book is always, nobody knows anything, which is true. And then the second thing I always remember from that book was he would say, once you take a script out of the typewriter, it is no longer yours. This is a collaboration. You're along for the ride. That's what you need to go do. And that's great. The problem is you have to really plot it out. I'm actually had a friend of mine who's, we're me and my old partner, Dan Pine, are about to adapt this series of mystery novels, and a friend of mine has a pilot that he sold to Fox, and he literally was kind of stuck, and he came over. We met for breakfast yesterday and sat for 4 hours where he wanted to bounce off me to help him with the plot of his pilot. And it's one of those things I hadn't, I've done it on my own thing, but to work with somebody else in the last couple of years, I hadn't done a lot of that. And it's just, I kind of realized, oh my God, you have to figure every freaking thing out, because you can't have the luxury of like figuring it out as you go along or having it come to you because you have too many people, everything from fellow writers to producers to studios to networks to film crews to actors, needing to have a roadmap as to where it's going, right? So you can't just sort of like the day, of this, you're going to shoot, you just can't suddenly appear with something. Whereas like the great thing about novels is I found out that because I have a good sense of where I'm going structure-wise, I can literally kind of not know exactly where I'm going the next day. And I have the luxury of discovering that. And that's been so freeing and so wonderful.
Scott, I'm fascinated by the beginnings of things, that moment of inspiration. just truly fascinates me because in one moment, and this is the way I describe it to people a lot of times, in one moment, the Last Commandment does not exist in any form or fashion. It just doesn't exist. And then either a character walks onto the stage of your mind, and then you're like, well, what is this character up to? And then you start seeing his story, and or maybe you watch a news program on TV, and you start playing the what if game in your mind, and then characters populate that what if story, and then in in one in one instant, the Last Commandment exists in some shape, and then it's your job as the writer to excavate that story and to pull it out of the ground and figure out what it is. What is that first moment? What was that first moment of inspiration for you with the Last Commandment?
It's funny because I honestly can't remember. Because it's come up a few times over the last few weeks, and because I've had the idea for so long. I mean, it's like literally been in my head, Hank, for like 30 years. And what happened is, like, I think it was around the time I was doing The Equalizer. I was thinking, oh, write a movie. And I really never have written movies. I've just worked on 25 television shows and now the novels, which is plenty. But I had this idea, and I think, part of it was nuts. It was kind of around Lethal Weapon. And I sort of had this idea, well, what's a kind of, because I thought it was a film, right? I thought, like, what about I must have landed somehow about something about Scotland Yard. Maybe it was working with Edward, on The Equalizer. What about a Scotland Yard cop? Who would be the antithesis to put him against? And way back then, it was like, okay, and I kind of in my head, it was like at the time, hey, Sean Connery could be him at 60 years old at the time in the movie, and Frankel could be Robert De Niro in his 30s. I mean, that's how long back it was. And some young British actress could play, Rachel. Well, anyway, it's just so sad. I never got around to it. I had never been I came up with these two ideas, these two cops, sort of oil and water. London cop, fish out of water. New York cop, fish out of water. Start in London, go to New York, then go to London. I mean, that's sort of what sort of came up. And then it just sat. I had never been to London at that time. I'd spent a lot of time in New York. One of the nice benefits of waiting 30 years, and I had too much in my head, because I have lots of ideas. They just sit in my head like a runway, and I'm the air traffic controller who allows them to come up. By the time I got around to starting this book a few years ago, I spent a lot of time in London. I mean, I always loved the idea of it as a writer. So it becomes sort of a tale of two cities. Also, they're like the fourth and fifth characters in the book, London and New York. And so that's where the first idea sort of came from. And then I guess at some point I had read, this was before Seven, and it was before the Da Vinci Code. There was the other book that really influenced me. There was a book by Lawrence Sanders. You remember Lawrence Sanders? And The First Deadly Sin, which is like one of the first great serial killer books. And some guy's killing according to the 7 deadly sins. So I kind of, sort of said, okay, how do you take that and make it your own? And then the 10 Commandments or something like that. Maybe I'd seen the movie on TV. That's what it started. And then I always had in my head for the last 30 years, all I had in this, idea, and it never really changed. I knew how it opened with the killing at the start. I knew that it was going to get you to New York at the end of what would be the opening of a movie or then a book. And I knew it would start in New York, end up in London. And I knew, the one thing I did know, I knew who did it, and I knew where it would end. The rest of it, I had no idea until I sat down and started to write the book. But the biggest thing, and to go back to your thing about the freedom and discovering, what really changed and was really eye-opening for me is by the time I sat and, wrote this manuscript a couple of years ago, there's a scene really early on when Grant, it's like the first night Grant and Frankel, Grant being the Scotland Yard cop, and then this young New York cop, they go to compare notes, and they go to a little coffee shop called the Astro Diner, which happened to be on the corner of 55th and 6th, which is where we used to live upstairs when I was doing The Equalizer, my wife and I, and we would order up chocolate milkshakes in the middle of the night. So that's where Frankel's love of chocolate milkshakes comes. So everything has like some kind of root somewhere. And there's this thing where the Scotland Yard cop notices that the young cop has a wedding ring on his finger. And I was just writing that. I mean, I didn't, and he sort of said, "Oh, you're married." And then he tells, and suddenly I almost came out of nowhere. I have Frankel tell this little story about how his ex-wife, his wife left him for another man for the super in their building, and they went off to Hawaii. And but he just couldn't bring himself to take the ring off. And talked about psychologically why he just thought, just wasn't ready to do it, blah, blah, blah. And he says something about, well, maybe I'm just waiting for the right person to come along to do that. And it sort of framed where I wanted to go with the book, and it framed him as a much kinder, gentler, troubled guy. And one of the nice things that people have reacted to the book is, that people sort of say there is a there's a respect between the two men. It's not oil and water, which is the way I originally conceived it. It becomes a kind of not even begrudging partnership. It's just they go about things differently, and they have a lot of mutual interests at the same time. And that not only informed that book, it informed the book after, and how I could write about these characters for a long time. So that it's just kind of evolved, which is great.
When you talk a little bit, if you would, about reader expectations. When you think of a Scotland Yard novel, there are certain things that you expect. It's going to be kind of a slow burn. It's going to be a deep psychological dive, because there have been writers before who have written in that way and kind of defined a genre, if you will. You take a lot of those things and turn them on their head in The Last Commandment in a brilliant way. It's not off-putting at all, but when you come into something with an expectation, where does that come from? That idea of subverting reader expectation, but not in a malicious way, in a fun, let's see where we can take this genre next kind of way.
Well, I want it to be fun. I mean, it's even though the murders are kind of brutal, they're kind of done with a wink, and I kind of want to make sure that people could, not put it down because it's too gory and it's glorifying that stuff. And it's really like an engine. I mean, what became to me, honestly, was the book's all about, to me, was interesting, was the journey of these three characters, and particularly with Grant at the center and his relationship with his daughter. And that was really important. I'm going, how do I get to that? I mean, and I'm not going to spoil any of the book or whatever, but, there's a conversation towards the end of the book, between right at the end of the book. That's what the whole book's about. I mean, everything else is just kind of fun between father and daughter. That's what was important to me, I've always said, like, everything I kind of write, maybe it's part of the strange relationship, that I have with my father, and being, like I mentioned, like a big Bruce Springsteen fan. My favorite Springsteen line, and I always write to it, is we're born into this life paying for the sins of someone else's past, from Adam raised to Cain. And that, is at the heart of all these mysteries and thrillers, right, that we all read, noir American fiction particularly, but also some of the great Nordic fiction now and the British fiction, and all the stuff we read. So, to me, those are the stories, and that mystery and that plays out in here in everything I've ever done and in the books going forward. So that's one thing. I also say that part of me wants you to feel really bad about feeling good about something and really good about feeling bad about something. And it's like, some people have read, I've got a bunch of people, read the first book, have read the new book, the second book, it'll come out next summer, called Till Death. And to a person, they all love the first one. They like the second one even better. And I'm going, oh, great. It's because they like the characters. And it's they'll say on a page, suddenly you'll hit something that's heartbreaking and heartwarming at the same time. And that's the way I've always written. And that's all I really care about, is heart and how but you get to it, like you say, by turning its head on it. And then the last thing I always sort of say is, I really do believe that good things come to those who wait. And so I always think it's like writing in contrast, right? Is my wife, when she read the first book and the second book, she says, these three characters are like, they're so nice. They're good. She says, like, I said, there's something wrong there. She says, no, it's just you read all these books about all these horrible people, these noir things. I said, yeah, but you know what? I said, I want you to root for these people. Look what's going on around them. I mean, it's like, they're in this dark, crazy world with a malicious serial killer. So to me, it allows me to kind of play both things. And that's kind of what, is really interesting to me. And I guess I learned that from the get-go. And I would say Rod Serling is one of the first people who does that. He put some weird genre thing. But what I always took about it from is, like beauty lies in the eye of the beholder. The woman with the, remember that Twilight Zone episode with the woman with the face that she has the surgery, and they keep saying you're going to be beautiful or not beautiful, and she turns out she's really, to us she looks really beautiful, and to everybody else they all look like pigs. And it's kind of like you're sitting there going, like, it's all, it all comes from perspective. And that's what I took away from that, besides the shock of it. Because the surprise of, anything, it's only going to get you once, right? then you kind of go and say, how did they do that? And you go back and read things because it's about characters. So it just keeps coming back to that. And that was one of the nice things about TV, because of continuing characters. You write about characters all the time, and you want to bring them back into people's living room every week.
I love hearing that you're inspired by music. I am like that as well. I can hear a song and a complete book just unfolds, in my mind, and it a lot of times it has absolutely nothing to do with the song. Maybe it's a line in the song that triggers something, or it's just an emotive experience. I have other friends who have to write in complete silence and can't have any outside influence whatsoever, and I find that crazy. And they in turn think I'm crazy. So what about being inspired by other things? And I love that music does that for you.
Yeah, music's a big thing. I mean, I'm obviously the same as you. I write with music blaring. I make these playlists, and and it's funny, I listen to a lot of oldies because like somebody said, the music you listen to when you're in your teens is the music you listen to, or versions of it, the rest of your life, right? And so that for me was the Beatles, as a kid, Springsteen, and then being from California, singer-songwriters. Crosby, Stills and Nash, Jackson Brown, Joni Mitchell, Neil Young, all those, the Eagles, all that stuff. And so to me, I've always had that on. And the thing I always know writing-wise is I'll be writing for a few hours, and then I kind of go like, wait, I missed those 6 songs. Did I skip them? And I realize you're just so into what you're writing that it's just feeding in. And I've always been able to write with music on when I'm rewriting, especially because I think it just pushes you and it inspires you just in terms of just getting, your creative juices going. I can't read with music on because I think it's pretty simple. It's like, what I take it down to is like, your insular thinking and you're taking something in, right? Is when you're reading, it's almost like, and you're listening to music, one thing's going in, one's going out, and they're working against each other. So that's why, to me, music's great. And then just being inspired, and it's starting with Springsteen. Springsteen's he's in this book, right? The first book is literally Descending Sun comes from Because of the Night, the Springsteen song, Take Me Now as the Sun Descends. So yeah, I love it. It's like, and I hear a lyric and I'll think about something. A lot of it is also all the TV shows I've done because I spent a lot of time working with the editors, and I'm always like sometimes writing with a song in my head that you play in the background to it, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very important. My music taste is pretty much like I say, it's sort of 60s, 70s, and those guys are still playing. Luckily, I have a 60-year-old character at the center of it, so he can like that music.
Right.
And then I just made my 35-year-old cop. He's from New Jersey, so he can like Springsteen, even though he's only 35. So, it allows me to kind of get in what I want to get,
Well, there's lots of oldie stations now, so you can be influenced by Springsteen at any age now. When we meet Metropolitan Police Commander Austin Grant in The Last Commandment, he is basically on his last case. Which is a great place to introduce a character, he said, laughing. We have this wizened character. On one hand, he's also jaded by a lot of things, but he has all of this experience that he's bringing with him, and we all know that the other side of experience that you bring with you is baggage that you bring with you. What was it like to introduce a character at the end of his career to a new series?
I was just having this conversation with my friend yesterday working on this pilot, and I think it goes with any book and pilots, especially for TV series. When you're starting something out, it's why now, right? Why are you starting here? Why didn't you start 10 days ago? Why didn't you start 10 years ago? And so I said, okay, what's the spot where I could put the most pressure on him and load him up? And I had this idea that, I wanted him, and because I'm this incurable, sappy romantic, that I love the idea about here's a guy who lost the love of his life and life hasn't been the same. So he's just going to go off and disappear and leave. And then suddenly this case comes in, and then it also has to come, and it comes back to reflect on him and his life and his family and everything. So it was a great crucible to put him in. And, and then the idea was, it gave a ticking clock on it because I just, without not really spoiling anything, is if you're going to start with he's got 3 weeks left, and it's over Christmas and New Year's, and there's a case, and there's this killer going out there, it's probably going to go right down to the end of the year. So I kind of knew where it gave me a goal, someplace to go. And then, one of the things, it's interesting, the Scotland Yard of it all. I mean, Otto Penzler, my publisher who publishes Mysterious Press and owns the Mysterious Bookshop, and knows more about mystery fiction than anybody.
Has been on the show before.
Yeah, it's great.
Fantastic guy.
And we've known each. That's a whole long story about how I got back to do this with him, and it's been great. But Otto, when he wanted to put the subtitle on the book, I said, well, that's okay. But I said, and he talked about Scotland Yard. He was talking about Adam Daglish, the P.D. James. And I said, did really well. I said, yeah. I said, but you know what? I mean, I'm going to write more of these, and I'll tell you this. And he's like, you're not going to work at Scotland Yard anymore. So you're not going to call the second one an Austin Grant, formerly of Scotland Yard novel, will go around the back, right, of the book. But we'll deal with that when we do. It was a really great place to put him in, and that's why I started there with him. And it's also a character I hadn't seen a lot of too. It's like, he wasn't just your typical hard bit private eye who's been, working 20, the ones I love reading. You have to bring something a little bit different.
So where do you take this character from here? Do you continue to give him new challenges, new stories to tell? Is he going to reflect back on his lengthy career? How do you, when you take a character like this that you put these restraints on yourself from the beginning, so that to see where the story comes from, right. How do you start thinking about the future of that character?
Well, I always kind of knew, it's like, so the second book, it takes place 6 months after the fact. And what's interesting with him is he's bored out of his mind, because like he can only do so many crossword puzzles, read books. He's lonely, he's, and so then he gets involved in another personal situation in the second book that immediately grabs him. And so the second story, and involves the three of them, is very personal again. And by the end of that, people forget this 2 years from now anyway, when I get to the third one, is that it sort of reinvigorates his hunt, joy of the hunt and the puzzle. And so he's going forward, like the third book on, he opens up like a little sort of private inquiries, as he would sort of say it, office, and starts, kind of like the Equalizer a little bit, sort of starts to take on cases. And what it does, it gives me these three franchises going forward, Rachel being an investigative reporter, Frankel, a New York City cop, and then this former Scotland Yard, who's almost kind of like a private investigator to do stories. But the whole idea for me with this show, it might be a television show at some point, but with the Freudian slip there, but the books to me are always, the idea is to find some event in one, two, or all three of these characters' lives, some seminal event that I can then wrap a really cool mystery around. But it's really to kind of furtherly progress, Grant as he moves forward in his in his retirement, but kind of his new life. And then wherever this takes, without many spoiler alerts, where Rachel and Frankel go.
Well, I can't wait to see what you do with Austin Grant in the future. I am all in on this new series, and I know a lot of other people will be too. I'm going to clear a shelf just for Austin Grant.
Right.
The Last Commandment is out everywhere now. You can grab it in Kindle edition or hardcover if you want to. Click on the Amazon links in the show notes. Also in audiobook format. Have you listened to the audiobook yet, Scott?
No, I mean, I've listened to Sean, who reads it, who's great, British, and he does a really good job of it. I'm just not a big audiobook. I mean, I'm old school. I need to have the thing in my hand, which is, of course, the books are like chasing me out the door here at my house. But yeah, but it's great. I mean, I know people love it. And, here in LA, luckily, I don't, this is the pandemic. I walk around the block and play golf and write at my computer. I don't have that commute where an audiobook would be great.
Yeah. Well, we'll put links to the audiobook as well. It's,
Yeah.
Lots of audiobook lovers these days, and I know it's going to be fantastic. Scott, if people are just discovering you and want to dig into all the great stuff that you do, where can they find you online?
They can go to my website, which is Scott Shepherd, SHEPHERD. It's scottshepherdauthor.com. And if you go there, you can find links to, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. But that's the place to go, And we'll put this interview there for people. We'll find it there, and other things I've talked about, and we're putting reviews and we're trying to do some fun things, and some articles I'm going to write. And we'll probably at some point access some of the television stuff. But yeah, that's kind of where we're at.
Love it. I love the book, The Last Commandment. It's one of my favorite books I've read this year. We're going to send everyone to pick up their copy. Scott, this has been so much fun chatting. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show.
Thanks for having me, Frank. It was a joy talking to you.
Wargate Books presents Hit and Fade, Forgotten Ruin, Book 2, by Jason Anspach and Nick Cole. Narrated for you by Christopher Ryan Grant. Chapter 1. The army of the dead walked straight into our ambush east of Fortress Hawthorne. That's what the FOB is called now, Fortress Hawthorne. Despite it being officially known as Forward Operating Base Hawthorne, as was originally intended when the 50 detachments of various special operations groups came forward through time from Area 51. A one-way mission to save Western civilization from a rampaging nanoplague destroying the very fabric of said civilization. Apparently, we overshot the temporal insertion point and stuck the landing. Sorta. About 10,000 years too late. Said civilization is now basically something straight out of Tolkien or Dungeons and Dragons, which we've all now gotten a lot more familiar with thanks to our resident expert and fledgling hedge wizard, the infamous PFC Kennedy. But the Rangers just call it the FOB. The first of our explosives to ruin the leading elements of the army of the dead advancing on us, Claymore Mines, the recaptured forge back at Hawthorne, had cranked out in the weeks after we'd retaken it from King Triton, were fired by Ranger Sergeant Kang down there with the Scouts and Captain Knifehand's assaulters. It was close to midnight when the front rank of bony warriors, carrying rotting shields and spears, eyes glowing malevolently in the deep night mist, advanced into our ambush, only to get ruined by the daisy-chained claymores' sudden eruption. Above us, a cloud-shrouded moon cast a wan yellow light over the battlefield. The night was hot, and spring was coming on full now. The pilots who'd gotten us here in the grounded C-17 back at Ranger Alamo, using their meteorology skills, had guessed it was going to be a long, hot summer ahead of us, and an early one at that. But there was a cold shiver in the dark on your exposed skin that you couldn't quite explain when you saw the dead advancing rank after rank. The bone warriors, carrying spear and shield. Other, darker creatures barely seen. The lower areas of the earth were graveyard cool and misty, so maybe that was it. Still, the brutal, unrelenting cold of our almost last stand back at Ranger Alamo was gone now. But not the horrors. There wasn't a night that some ranger didn't wake up out of a tormented sleep, breathing heavy, sidearms scanning the dark and looking for orcs and ogres to ventilate. I was sweating in the hour leading up to the attack, despite the night and the mist. Kurtz had us humping hard to get the 240 and all its ammo up to the top of a small hill that overlooked the area where we'd channel the advancing echelons of the Army of the Dead into further fun and games the Rangers had planned at a bend in a riverbed. If the approaching Army of the Dead continued on their current course track, they'd enter it for a brief period. It was decided by the captain we'd kill them there. And I was sweating. Not because of fear. No, Not at all. "Firing," whispered Sergeant Kang over the comm as he detonated the mines. And 8 daisy-chained claymores spat thousands of steel balls all across the front line of what even I was still finding it hard to believe I was seeing through my night vision device. Skeletons. Warrior skeletons. Ancient warriors like something out of the Bronze or Iron Ages. Worked breastplates of molded plate or rotting scales. Green and tarnished, stamped with the markings of fabled armies fallen in battles long, long ago. Leather cuirasses on some, rotting boots, helms with broken horns, missing teeth, tattered leather kilts, beads and charms dangling from bone wrists, enigmatic holy signs and primal torques black with grave dirt, or from a funeral pyre long ago on some forgotten battlefield far from here, draped about the spine where the throat should be, where it rises to connect to a bone-white skull that seems filled with malevolent purpose and diabolical intelligence, malignantly so. Walking skeletons like something out of a Ray Harryhausen clay model Sinbad epic from the 1960s. Above, the sliver of moon gave enough light to strengthen our NVGs, making the night vision devices perform exceptionally well as we sprang our trap and watched the advancing elements get rocked by our initial high-explosive opening bid in the game we were about to play. The air was still and hot in the moments before the fight began as we lay there in the tall, sharp grass, waiting for it all to go down. I was thinking a hot cup of coffee would be nice about now, except my canteen only had cold coffee I'd brewed during the long, silent, and windy afternoon of preparation. Still, I was happy knowing I had some, rather than none.
Authors, if you're looking for a partner to help ensure that your book is the best it can possibly be, look no further than Pico's House. Crystal and her staff make a conscious effort to be critical yet courteous. They also strive to make the business side of things run smoothly so that you can rest easy knowing that your manuscript is in capable hands. Whether you need beta reading, developmental editing, a manuscript critique, line editing, copy editing, or proofreading, Pico's House is the one-stop shop for you. Check them out today at picoshouse.com to get started.